The air in the conference room was thick enough to chew. Truck Lagoon lay silent outside, its waters glassy under a sky that refused to shine. Inside, the admirals of the Imperial Navy sat surrounded by the ghosts of their own victories, charts, reports, and maps once filled with triumph, now radiating quiet doom. Cigarette smoke curled through the still air like incense at a funeral. No one spoke. No one needed to. The sound of a pencil rolling off the table was enough to make everyone flinch. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi finally exhaled and broke the silence. "Gentlemen, we need to acknowledge what these numbers are telling us." He didn't raise his voice, but it landed like a hammer. "The war," he said, "was lost." No one contradicted him. Not because they agreed, but because they could no longer pretend otherwise. They all knew. The Battle of Midway had stripped Japan of her naval soul. The empire that had risen with the sun was now bleeding beneath it. To understand how men who once commanded the greatest naval strike force in history could sit in such silence, we have to go back to the morning that promised everything and doomed them all. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. That dawn had been their masterpiece. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's plan had been precise to the minute. Japanese aircraft streaked through the Hawaiian sky like shards of sunlight, their bombs blooming over American battleships still at anchor. It was the most daring attack in naval history. 8 battleships sunk or crippled, 188 aircraft destroyed, and over 2,000 American lives lost in less than 2 hours. The Japanese pilots returned to their carriers as heroes. Across Tokyo, bells rang, newspapers shouted, and people bowed toward the imperial palace. Japan had done the unthinkable, humiliated the United States Navy in its own waters. But in that same hour of triumph, the seeds of destruction were already sown. The carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga America's real power weren't in port. The massive fuel storage depots, the submarine base, and the repair docks were left untouched. Yamamoto, who had studied at Harvard and understood the scale of American industry, knew what that meant. His officers toasted victory. He poured himself a drink and whispered the words that history would never forget, or perhaps never accurately record. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Whether he truly said those words or not, his fear was real. He knew Japan had won only a battle of hours, not a war of years. In the weeks that followed, the Japanese Navy reveled in a string of rapid conquests: Hong Kong, the Philippines, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies. To the public, it looked unstoppable. But in secret reports circulated among senior officers, a grim countdown had already begun. Intelligence estimated Japan had a window of 6 to 8 months before American industry would erase every advantage. 6 months of dominance. Then the tide would turn. That was Yamamoto's private terror. He had begged his government not to start this war, warning that Japan could run wild for half a year, maybe a year, before drowning under American steel and oil. The politicians had laughed. They saw the United States as soft an empire of consumers, not warriors. They believed the Americans lacked the stomach for blood. The Japanese, they said, were forged in the fire of the samurai. Honor would triumph over machinery. Now, 8 months later, Yamaguchi's conference room was a tomb of that illusion. The maps on the wall still showed the empire at its greatest extent, an ocean turned into a Japanese lake. But the numbers on the papers told another story. Losses mounting, fuel dwindling, morale eroding. The admirals looked at one another and saw in each other's faces what none dared to say aloud, that Yamamoto's nightmare had arrived exactly on schedule. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, the man who had led the air attack on Pearl Harbor, was there too, his arm still bandaged from wounds at Midway. He studied the charts in silence. He had once stood over Oahu, watching America burn. Now he felt the same fire under his own feet. He could still smell the oil, the smoke, the charred air over Pearl Harbor. But now it was his own navy, drowning in that same black tide. The silence stretched. A single fan creaked overhead. Someone coughed. Yamaguchi looked around the room. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "it seems that in striking first, we have struck our last." His words hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. No one answered. Outside, Truck Lagoon shimmered like a painting calm. Endless, deceitfully beautiful. It was the heart of Japan's Pacific operations, now pulsing faintly like a dying heart. Beneath its tranquil surface lay the wrecks of ships that would soon join them, machines built for war, now waiting for oblivion. As night fell, the admirals sat in silence once more. Some stared at their shoes, others at the maps. They knew history would remember Pearl Harbor as Japan's greatest triumph. But for the men in that room, it had become something else, the opening act of a tragedy they could no longer rewrite. By the end of that August night in 1942, the empire of the rising sun had already begun to set. The roar of victory in December 1941 had been deafening. Tokyo's streets had exploded in celebration flags, parades, women tossing confetti from balconies as the radio blared news of Pearl Harbor's destruction. For one fleeting moment, the Japanese Empire stood taller than it ever had. The emperor's portrait was paraded through the city like an idol of destiny fulfilled. But behind the cheering, the admirals knew what the public did not. The victory had been magnificent, yes, but also hollow. It was a spectacle of fire and smoke, masking a fundamental truth. Japan had just punched a giant that could punch back harder than any nation in history. From the start, Yamamoto understood that Japan had gambled everything on speed. He had calculated, almost to the week, how long it would take for America's colossal industrial heart to turn itself toward war. 6 months, he had told his staff. Perhaps 8, if the gods favor us. After that, the tide would not just rise, it would swallow. At Pearl Harbor, the Japanese strike force, 6 fleet carriers, more than 400 aircraft had performed with mechanical precision. The American battleships lay in ruins, their hulks bleeding oil into the harbor's blue water. To the pilots circling above, the scene looked like divine proof of Japan's superiority. But the details that weren't destroyed would matter more than those that were. The fuel storage tanks, the arteries that fed the Pacific Fleet, remained untouched. The submarine base, whose boats would later strangle Japan's shipping lanes, was still intact. Even the repair docks survived, meaning many of the sunk ships could rise again. Yamamoto had won a tactical masterpiece but failed strategically. It was a failure born not of cowardice, but of success. The Japanese Navy had trained itself to think in perfect maneuvers and flawless execution. They believed wars were won by precision, not production. To destroy the carriers would have been ideal, but Nagumo, the commander on scene, refused to risk his planes for a third strike. He was cautious, afraid of losing what he had gained. In doing so, he preserved his fleet, but doomed the war effort. In the following weeks, Japan swept through Asia with terrifying momentum. Singapore fell in just 2 months. The British Empire's fortress of the East collapsed like a stage prop. The Philippines followed, its defenders starved into submission. Java, Malaya, Burma, all tumbled under the crimson banner of the rising Sunday Tokyo's newspapers declared a new age, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a polite name for empire. In reality, it was conquest wrapped in ideology. Japanese schoolchildren were taught that they were liberating Asia from Western colonialism. A few asked why liberation required so much blood. Even as the empire expanded, Yamamoto's warnings returned to haunt him. America had not sued for peace. America had not hesitated. Instead, within weeks, its shipyards began running 24 hours a day. Across the Pacific, the sleeping giant was stirring, factories roaring, furnaces glowing, women flooding into assembly lines in overalls and bandanas. In Detroit, Seattle, San Diego, every hammer blow was a drumbeat of retribution. By early 1942, Japan's intelligence services reported something unnerving. The United States was already replacing its losses faster than Japan could count them. American aircraft production had tripled within months. Carriers were under construction in numbers no Japanese planner believed possible. Japan's admirals began to realize that every ship they lost would be gone forever, while every American ship sunk would soon return, larger and faster than before. But to the public, the illusion continued. Propaganda films showed Japanese soldiers standing over captured British officers. Children sang songs about the empire that would last 1,000 years. Tokyo's radio announcers called the Americans merchants playing at war. The irony was bitter. Japan was the one fighting like a merchant, hoarding victories as if they were coins, each one losing value as inflation devoured the currency of hope. Inside naval headquarters, the tone was different. Reports began to show new numbers: losses of pilots, shortages of aviation fuel, exhaustion among crews. Yamamoto ordered another grand operation, one that could destroy America's remaining carriers before they multiplied beyond reach. That operation would bear a name destined to echo through history: Midway. Before the fleet sailed, some officers confessed their unease. One even asked, "What if we have misjudged the Americans again?" The question was met with silence. No one dared speak the truth aloud. Japan had built a culture where doubt was treason. Every officer was expected to believe victory inevitable, even when the evidence screamed otherwise. As the fleet departed, Tokyo's newspapers printed headlines of destiny: the next blow to crush the American Pacific Fleet forever. But Yamamoto, pacing aboard his flagship, was quiet. He knew he was sending his best pilots, the last truly irreplaceable generation of men Japan had. He watched the horizon as the carriers vanished into the mist, and for a brief moment, the great admiral who had orchestrated Pearl Harbor felt something he had not felt since his youth: dread. Because he knew the truth hidden beneath every toast, every salute, every glowing headline. The empire had built its triumph on sand, and the tide was already coming in. The sea was calm on the morning of June 4th. 1942, too calm to the Japanese fleet steaming toward Midway. It felt like the universe was holding its breath. 6 months earlier, they had struck Pearl Harbor with precision and arrogance. Now, they were here to finish the job. The plan was elegant on paper, as all Japanese plans would draw out the remaining American carriers, crush them, and end the war in one decisive stroke. But the ocean has a cruel sense of humor. As the sun climbed higher, American dive bombers, guided by intelligence the Japanese didn't know had been stolen, appeared out of a sky that had seemed empty a heartbeat before. Within minutes, the pride of Japan's carrier fleet, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, was on fire. Flames ripped across their decks like angry gods reclaiming stolen glory. Pilots, trapped in cockpits slick with fuel, screamed prayers to ancestors who no longer answered. Deck crews leapt into the boiling sea, uniforms melting against their skin. The ocean hissed as burning oil spread across it in wide black sheets. By the time the sun set, Japan's illusion of invincibility was gone. The numbers that later arrived on Yamaguchi's desk in Truck Lagoon were merciless. 4 carriers lost half of Japan's frontline naval aviation strength. Over 3,000 men dead. Hundreds of elite pilots' men who had trained for years, some since the early 1000, 930 seconds gone. They had been the Navy's crown jewels, each one more valuable than gold, each one irreplaceable. Japan could still build ships. It could not build experience. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had commanded the first wave at Pearl Harbor, later called Midway the death of the old Navy. He wasn't wrong. After that day, the balance of power shifted forever. Japan entered the war with 10 carriers. By August 1942, only 6 remained, and 2 were too damaged to sail. America, by contrast, was building new carriers faster than Japan could replace a single one. In shipyards from Newport News to San Francisco, steel skeletons were rising Essex-class carriers, vast and modern, capable of launching more planes, traveling farther, surviving more damage. The first of them would sail within months. By 1944, there would be dozens. It was as though Japan had thrown a sword at a mountain. The admirals meeting in August of that year studied production reports that didn't look real. In 1941, American factories had built about 19,000 aircraft, Japan's around 5,000. But the gap was no longer arithmetic, it was exponential. By 1943, American industry was projected to produce 85,000 planes a year. Japan, barely 16,000. And only if every factory survived bombing and shortages, that was an impossible if. Inside the meeting room, silence reigned again. The admirals stared at the papers with eyes that no longer saw strategy, only mathematics. Every man in that room understood the implications. For every Japanese Zero that took to the air, 5 American Wildcats or Hellcats would rise to meet it. For every bomber Japan lost, the US could send 10 more. For every pilot who didn't return, there would be no replacement waiting. Japan's pilot corps had begun the war as legends, warriors who treated flight like art, who believed dying for the emperor was an honor beyond all others. By mid-1942, that philosophy was killing them faster than the enemy. Roughly 40% of Japan's carrier pilots were already dead, lost in the Coral Sea, in the flames of Midway, or on the endless sorties over the Solomon Islands. Their replacements were children, by comparison barely 200 hours in the air, trained in haste, pushed into battle before they had even learned the smell of engine oil and sea salt. American training, by contrast, was a machine of numbers and repetition. The US was producing thousands of pilots monthly. They weren't as polished as the Japanese at first, but they lived long enough to learn. And, when they returned from missions, they taught others. Japan's veterans, meanwhile, died faster than they could be replaced. The experience drain was irreversible. The admirals knew this. Fuchida himself, still recovering from his wounds, presented a tactical analysis that made the room physically colder. At current attrition rates, Japan would run out of experienced carrier pilots by mid-1943, no matter how many new ships they built. The numbers didn't lie. The Empire had crafted the finest swordsmen in the sky, but the enemy had built a factory that made swordsmen faster than Japan could bury them. And there was another cruelty: submarines. The Japanese had built some of the most advanced submarines in the world, but they used them for fleet reconnaissance hunting warships, not supply lines. The Americans did the opposite. Their submarines stalked Japan's merchant fleet with mechanical patience, cutting arteries one by one. Japan's empire was a body that needed constant feeding oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Burma, iron from Manchuria, all of it traveled by sea. By August 1942, that sea had become a graveyard. In January, Japan had lost 15 merchant ships. By June, 30. In August, 40. The trend was exponential. The empire was bleeding out through the Pacific, drop by drop, ton by ton. The admirals could only stare as Yamaguchi read the latest figures. At this rate, one whispered, Japan wouldn't have enough shipping to feed its own people by 1944, let alone fuel its navy. They were watching the slow-motion death of their own civilization, calculated in steel and salt water outside. The lagoon shimmered. It was beautiful, the kind of beauty that mocks the dying. Yamaguchi looked out the window for a long time before speaking. "We were never fighting America's army," he said quietly. "We were fighting its factories." No one answered. There was nothing left to say. The realization was too large to argue with, too heavy to fight. The empire had reached too far, too fast, and the ocean, once their domain, had turned against them. By late summer 1942, the empire stretched like a net cast too wide, from Burma to the Bismarck Sea, from the Aleutians to Java. Japan's red sun fluttered over a vast patchwork of conquered lands. On the maps pinned to the walls of the Imperial Navy's command center, it looked glorious. A chain of victories, an empire of islands, a defensive wall across half the Pacific, but the admirals knew maps lie. Each red line on those charts represented a supply route that no longer existed. The very size of Japan's conquests had become its own undoing. The empire had devoured more than it could digest. Thousands of garrisons were scattered across jungles and atolls, all hungry for food, ammunition, and fuel commodities Japan no longer possessed in abundance. Supply convoys snaked across the Pacific, easy prey for the American submarines that now hunted them relentlessly. Every sinking meant another outpost cut off, another island slowly starving. Reports from Rabaul and the Solomons told of soldiers eating coconuts for weeks, of hospitals without medicine, of pilots siphoning fuel from grounded aircraft just to fly one more mission. Commanders requested reinforcements. Tokyo sent silence. The empire's lifeline was being cut one thread at a time. Yamaguchi's August meeting reflected that slow-motion strangulation. Admiral Yamaguchi presented the shipping statistics in a voice that barely rose above a whisper. In January, 15 merchant ships lost. In June, 30. In August, 40. Gone beneath the waves. Each ship carried not just cargo but time. Time Japan would never get back. The calculation was merciless. Japan could build maybe 200,000 tons of new merchant shipping per year. It was losing 300,000 tons monthly. Every sunken freighter was another artery severed. At this rate, Yamaguchi said, Japan would not merely lose the war, it would cease to function as a modern nation. 2 factories would close. Cities would darken, even rice would vanish from the emperor's table. No one spoke for a long while. The sound of the fan above them was the only thing alive in the room. But Japan's strategic catastrophe was deeper than logistics. It was philosophical. The nation's military doctrine was built on the belief that spirit could triumph over matter. Yamato Damashi. The Japanese soul was considered stronger than any machine. They believed courage could replace resources, and sacrifice could outmatch industry. But courage can't refuel ships, and sacrifice can't feed armies. The United States, by contrast, was fighting a war of mathematics and momentum. Its generals thought like engineers, not warriors. They measured victory in tonnage, in gallons, in factory output per hour. And the Americans could choose where to strike. Japan had to defend everywhere. That was the cruel geometry of empire. One side could pick its battles, the other could only wait. The admirals at Truk Lagoon saw this imbalance clearly. For every defensive outpost Japan built, the Americans only needed to ignore it, leapfrog it, and strangle it from the air. Even as the Japanese fortified island after island, American construction battalions were paving airstrips in the South Pacific, on Guadalcanal, on Espiritu Santo, on Efate. Once the Americans captured an airfield, the surrounding sea became death for any Japanese ship that dared approach. Japan's conquests had become prisons. Meanwhile, At home, the illusion of victory persisted. Tokyo's censors ensured that newsreels showed nothing but triumph. Families gathered around radios to hear about glorious victories that had never happened. But inside the military bureaucracy, panic was spreading like rot beneath polished floors. Fuel rationing began. Civilians were told to collect scrap metal for the war effort. Women melted down kitchen pots for steel that would never reach the front. Yamamoto had foreseen this nightmare long before Pearl Harbor. He had warned the cabinet that Japan's economy was a candle burning at both ends. The empire produced silk and rice, but not oil, not iron, not bauxite. Without imports, it could not fight a modern war. The seizure of the Dutch East Indies had been meant to solve that problem. Instead, it had created another. The oil was there, yes, but trapped behind thousands of miles of ocean crawling with American submarines. By August 1942, tanker losses had already begun to cripple naval operations. In January, Japan had imported nearly 400,000 tons of oil. By mid-year, barely half that amount reached its ports. The rest lay on the ocean floor. Each sinking wasn't just a statistic. It was a future battle that could no longer be fought. As the admirals discussed these numbers, a strange fatalism crept into the room. They still spoke in the language of plans and strategies. But everyone knew these were rituals, not realities. They were not planning for victory anymore, they were managing decline. Fuchida, the once proud commander of the Pearl Harbor strike, stared at the table and said quietly, "We created an empire of distance, not depth." No one disagreed. The meeting turned to the map, vast, intricate, full of lines that meant nothing now. From the Aleutians in the north to New Guinea in the south, the empire's defensive perimeter spanned thousands of miles. Yet every mile was a weakness. Every red flag on that map marked a place Japan could not truly protect. The irony was suffocating. In 6 months, Japan had conquered more territory than any empire in modern history. And, in doing so, it had guaranteed its own defeat. Outside, the lagoon glimmered under the setting sun, its waters calm and deceitful, but beneath that surface lay the future steel carcasses of ships not yet sunk but already doomed. Yamaguchi stood at the window and watched the light fade. "We have turned the ocean into a graveyard," he murmured. "And we are still building the headstones." As the August meeting dragged into the night, the conversation shifted from logistics to something far darker reflection. The admirals, hollow-eyed and exhausted, began to dissect the very event that had once made them legends. Pearl Harbor. It was supposed to be the perfect strike, the blow that would shatter America's will. Instead, it had become Japan's. Curse a triumph that chained them to an unwinnable war. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had commanded the carrier task force during the attack, sat in heavy silence. His face, usually sharp and proud, looked carved from fatigue. When he finally spoke, it was not to defend himself, but to confess. "We struck with the sword of heaven," he said softly, "but we did not cut deeply enough." The others knew what he meant. Pearl Harbor had achieved everything tactically and nothing strategically. The American battleships, the pride of the Pacific Fleet, had been destroyed. But battleships were already relics. The true weapon of the new age was the aircraft carrier, and the carriers Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga had all been at sea. They escaped untouched ghosts that would soon return with vengeance. Worse still, Nagumo had refused to launch a third wave. That extra strike could have destroyed the massive oil depots, the submarine base, and the repair docks, the real arteries of the Pacific Fleet. Without them, the Americans would have been crippled for a year or more. Instead, those facilities survived. Within months, the same docks that had burned became the birthplace of a new navy. The same harbor that had once smoldered would soon send fleets eastward to hunt the rising sun itself. The admirals sat in silence, as they remembered that moment of hesitation, the decision that had sealed their fate. It was an irony too heavy to bear. Caution, the rarest of Japanese military virtues, had doomed them more surely than recklessness ever could. But beyond the tactical errors lay something more profound, a total misunderstanding of the American mind. The architects of the attack had believed that a sudden, devastating strike would terrify the United States into negotiation. They thought Americans, comfortable and commercial, would never stomach a long war. They had studied American machinery, not American character. They could not have been more wrong. In the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, America did not break, it burned. Factories that had once built cars now forged bombers and tanks. Housewives traded aprons for overalls. Teenagers lied about their age to enlist. Hollywood turned the war into legend. The radio turned it into purpose. Pearl Harbor didn't paralyze America. It purified it. It gave the war a moral axis. To Americans, Japan's attack wasn't war. It was betrayal. The Japanese declaration of war, delayed by clerical error, arrived after the bombs had fallen. That single failure transformed an act of military aggression into a crime of deceit. A date which will live in infamy, President Roosevelt called it, and he was right. That phrase would outlive every Japanese victory. It united a divided nation overnight. It gave America not just reason, but righteousness. And righteousness, history has shown, can build armies faster than ambition ever will. The admirals at Truk knew all of this. They had seen the consequences unfold. The United States was no longer a sleeping giant. It was a machine of vengeance, running on the fuel of outrage. Yamaguchi pulled out a document yellowed, creased, and stained with oil. It was an analysis of the Doolittle raid, 4 months earlier. The paper trembled slightly in his hands as he read. 16 American B-25 bombers, launched from the carrier Hornet, had flown across the Pacific and dropped their bombs on Tokyo, Nagoya, Kobe, and Yokohama. The physical damage had been trivial, a few factories, a handful of casualties. But the psychological impact had been catastrophic. Japan's home islands, believed invulnerable, had been violated. For the first time, sirens wailed over Tokyo. Civilians scrambled into air raid shelters, clutching children, staring up at an enemy they could barely see. Panic rippled through the capital. The people who had once cheered Pearl Harbor now looked to the sky with fear. Yamaguchi read the intelligence summary aloud. Minimal material loss, it said, but severe impact on national morale. The phrase was bureaucratic, but the meaning was not. The Doolittle raid had humiliated Japan, and worse, it had forced their hand. The High Command had demanded retribution. They wanted to lure out and destroy the American carriers that had dared to strike the homeland. And so, the plan for Midway was born. The men in that August meeting understood the cruel irony. The Doolittle raid, so small, so militarily insignificant, had provoked the operation that would destroy Japan's carrier fleet. The Americans had baited them without even knowing it. Now, months later, they were sitting among the ashes of their own pride, staring at the arithmetic of annihilation. Outside, the night air at Truk was still and humid. The stars above the lagoon shimmered like silent witnesses. A few officers stepped onto the balcony, the glow of their cigarettes reflecting in the glass. "We gave them the one thing a democracy should never have," said one admiral quietly. "Unity." Another replied, "And we gave it to them for free." Back inside, the atmosphere felt heavier. The room smelled of tobacco, sweat, and the faint metallic tang of despair. Every admiral there had once believed they were invincible. Now they knew they were simply mortal men, serving an immortal delusion. Yamaguchi spoke last, his voice a whisper. "Pearl Harbor was not our beginning," he said. "It was our end disguised as glory. The others nodded, and for the first time that night, no one lit another cigarette. They had all felt it, the haunting truth behind the celebration of that December morning. The curse had been cast not by the enemy, but by their own success. The day of infamy had never really ended, it had simply changed sides. When the conversation returned to strategy, it felt almost ceremonial. Every admiral in the room knew they were discussing ghosts' plans that would never work, operations that would never happen. Yet they went through the motions, like priests performing a ritual for a god they no longer believed in. What if, one began, we had not attacked the United States at all? The question hung in the air, like smoke. It was dangerous to ask, but they were far beyond fear now. What if Japan had struck only the British and Dutch colonies in Southeast Asia? What if they had left Pearl Harbor untouched, focused on securing oil and rubber quietly, without awakening America's wrath? Would Roosevelt have been able to rally Congress to war? Would the isolationist tide in the US have delayed its entry long enough for Japan to fortify the Pacific? For a brief moment, they let themselves imagine it a parallel world where the empire stood unchallenged, where its conquests were complete before the sleeping giant stirred. But the fantasy faded as quickly as it came. Even in that imagined timeline, the result would be the same. America's industrial power was too vast, its resources too deep, its will too stubborn. A clash was inevitable. The ocean, Yamaguchi thought, had simply chosen to collect its debt sooner rather than later. Another admiral raised the second, great what if. What if we had finished the job at Pearl Harbor, he said. What if we had launched the third wave, destroyed the oil tanks, the repair docks, the submarines? Nods circled the table. They all remembered the arguments from that morning in December 1941. Some had begged Nagumo to strike again. But the air crews were exhausted, and he feared an American counterattack. He had chosen caution, preserving his planes instead of pressing the advantage. In hindsight, that decision seemed unforgivable. Had Japan burned the oil reserves, it might have delayed America's counteroffensive by months, perhaps half a year. 6 months was the empire's most precious currency. But even that, Yamaguchi admitted quietly, would not have changed the ending. The Americans would have rebuilt, just as they always did, faster and larger than anyone thought possible. A younger officer, his voice trembling, asked, "Then what could we have done?" No one answered. There was nothing to say. The truth was unbearable, because it was simple. There had never been a path to victory. Japan's economy was 1/10 the size of America's. Its oil production was non-existent without imports. Its population? Half that of the United States. Every measure of endurance, steel, fuel, industry, manpower belonged to the enemy. The empire had been built on audacity, not arithmetic, and the numbers had finally come to collect. Yamamoto had known this from the beginning. Long before the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor, he had warned his superiors that Japan could run wild for 6 months. Perhaps a year, but no longer. He had studied in America, seen its cities, its factories, its boundless capacity for reinvention. He understood that war was no longer about bravery or honor. It was about output, logistics, and time. But the politicians and generals in Tokyo hadn't wanted to hear that. They had called him a coward. They believed the Americans were soft, decadent, spoiled by comfort. They believed spirit could crush steel. And so Japan marched into a war it could not possibly win. Yamaguchi stood now, rubbing his temples, staring at the oil reports spread across the table. Tankers sunk, refineries silent. Imports down by nearly half since January. He could feel the weight of the empire pressing on his shoulders like a stone monument ready to collapse. The oil had been the entire reason for war. When the United States cut off supplies in 1941, Japan had faced a choice: withdraw from China or seize the Dutch East Indies. Pride made the decision easy. They took the oil fields by force, and for a few brief months it seemed to work. The wells pumped. The empire had secured its lifeblood. But success revealed its fatal flaw. Oil must travel, and to reach Japan, it had to cross thousands of miles of ocean. By 1942, those seas belonged to American submarines. The admirals reviewed the newest intelligence. Over half of Japan's tanker fleet destroyed or disabled. Each loss meant not just less oil, but fewer ships to carry food, weapons, medicine. The empire had conquered oil fields. It could not use water in a desert with no bucket to carry it home. Fuchida's voice broke the silence. "It is like a man dying of thirst while standing in the rain," he said. "We have everything we need everywhere, except where it matters." The metaphor lingered. Japan's great vision of self-sufficiency had become a closed circle. An empire that fed no one, supplied nothing, and consumed itself faster with every passing month. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over Truk Lagoon, though no rain followed. The admirals sat in dim yellow light, listening to the sound of paper rustling and the low hum of the electric fan. None of them spoke of surrender. It was unthinkable. To suggest peace was to invite suspicion, disgrace, perhaps execution. And yet, the idea had already rooted itself in each man's mind, growing quietly like mold in the corners of the room. They still issued orders, still planned offensives, still wrote reports full of confident phrases. But their words were hollow. The empire's strength was gone, its victories illusions, its leaders prisoners of their own myth. Finally, Yamaguchi said what everyone was thinking. "We are building walls out of water," he murmured. "Every plan, every hope, it slips through our fingers before it's even made." No one disagreed. The dream of victory had hardened into a monument of futility. The walls of reality were closing in, and inside them, Japan was already drowning. Dawn broke softly over Truk Lagoon, turning the still water to molten gold. Inside the conference room, the admirals of the Imperial Navy sat motionless, their silhouettes etched against the fading glow of lanterns. Papers were scattered across the table charts, casualty lists, oil shipment logs, all the debris of a dying empire. The long night of numbers had finally given way to a silence heavier than exhaustion. It was the silence of realization. No one dared to call it defeat. But they all knew. Captain Fuchida stared blankly at the wall map, its crimson flags marking islands that no longer mattered. Each one represented a place already lost, or soon to be. Guadalcanal, Rabaul, Tarawa, the Aleutians, the Empire's proud defensive line, now looked like a string of tombstones. "We can still fight," one younger officer muttered, almost to himself. Yamaguchi turned to him with tired eyes. "Yes," he said. "We can always fight. The question is whether we can still live." The remark hung in the air, neither defiant nor resigned, just true. For all their talk of honor and spirit, these were men of numbers. They knew the arithmetic of collapse. They had seen it in the fuel tanks running dry, in the dwindling ranks of trained pilots, in the convoys that never arrived. The Empire wasn't being defeated in battle. It was evaporating. Yet none of them could say it aloud. To speak the truth was treason. To accept it was madness. And so, they remained loyal to the illusion, a loyalty deeper and deadlier than any oath to the Emperor. The minutes ticked by in near silence. Only the ceiling fan dared move. Someone poured a cup of tea, the sound oddly fragile in the vast quiet. The steam rose, curled, and vanished, just like everything else. Finally, Admiral Yamaguchi stood. He was a proud man still, but his shoulders sagged beneath the weight of inevitability. He looked around the table at his peers. Men who had commanded fleets, led invasions, destroyed nations, now they looked more like survivors of a shipwreck, clinging to the last dry plank of denial. He said, "Simply, gentlemen, the war was lost on the day it began." No one argued. They didn't have to. It was not just a statement of fact, it was an exorcism. The others lowered their eyes. The cigarette smoke thickened, curling upward, like incense for the dead. Somewhere outside, a distant aircraft droned over the lagoon, a lone reconnaissance plane, the sound faint but steady. For a moment, every man in the room stopped breathing, listening to the hum fade into the horizon. When it was gone, the silence felt even larger. They knew what awaited them. The Empire would continue to fight. Orders would still come. Battles would still be waged. But for the first time, they understood that these battles had no meaning. They were gestures, echoes, shadows on the water. The war would grind on for years, killing millions more, but the outcome had already been written in ink, in numbers, in inevitability. Japan would fight to the end, not because it believed in victory, but because it could not imagine surrender. Pride had become its own battlefield. One admiral broke the silence. "If we recommend peace now," he said quietly, "we will be executed." Yamaguchi nodded. "Yes. But if we don't, our sons will be." No one replied. The words were too sharp, too near the truth. The meeting ended without adjournment. There was no point. One by one, the admirals gathered their papers, their cigarettes, their shame, and left the room. The sound of their footsteps echoed down the corridor, rhythmic and hollow. Each step was a confession. Each pause, a prayer. Outside, the tropical morning had turned brilliant. Sunlight flashed on the water, and the lagoon shimmered with deceptive peace. Below the surface, wrecks already slept destroyers, cargo ships, submarines. In 2 years, there would be hundreds more. As Yamaguchi stepped into the daylight, the heat hit him like a wall. He looked once more at the horizon, at the endless blue stretching toward the east, the direction from which the enemy would one day come. He thought of Yamamoto's prophecy, of the giant awakened, of the resolve that could not be undone. He closed his eyes. The sea breeze carried the faint scent of oil and salt, and rust the perfume of a fading empire. Somewhere behind him, a clerk closed the door of the conference room. The latch clicked softly, final as a gunshot. History would remember Pearl Harbor as a day of triumph. But for the men who had lived its aftermath, it was the beginning of silence, the long, slow silence of realization that glory is not the opposite of defeat, but its disguise. And so the empire that had risen with the sun sank into its own reflection, still fighting, still burning, still believing long after the light was gone.